Back to the deep dive. You want to really get your hands dirty with understanding states and governments, and that's what we're doing today. We've got a political science lecture. It's like straight from the classroom, and an article from history.com we'll be using as our guides today. But before we jump into all that, if you're enjoying these deep dives, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Absolutely. Get ready. We got a lot to cover.
Okay, so to kick things off, think about Bangladesh. They recently celebrated 50 years of independence, which marked a major shift for them from military rule to a parliamentary system. It just really shows you how these ideas of states and governments, they're not just abstract concepts.
hmm
They play out in the real world, impacting people's lives.
You're right on. And that transition really gets to the core of what a state, even IS, and how it decides to organize itself. So let's unpack this term state for a second. We use it all the time, but it hasn't always been around.
Right, so where did this idea of a state even come from?
Well, it emerged way back in 16th and 17th century Europe. It was a period of, constant conflict and upheaval. A real turning point was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It put an end to the 30 Years' War, which was just brutal, fueled by religious and political tensions. And from that emerged the principle of territorial sovereignty.
Okay, so sovereignty meaning a state has like total authority within its own borders.
Exactly. Now, sociologist Charles Tilly, he famously said, war made the state and the state made war. Kind of a provocative statement, right? It suggests that states were born out of conflict, and then in turn, they actually perpetuated more conflict to cement their power.
Hold on. So you're saying states need conflict to actually exist? That seems kind of counterintuitive, especially today when everyone's pushing for global peace and cooperation.
It's definitely complex. While we may not see those huge wars that created those early states, the relationship between power conflict and state formation, well, that's still shaping the world today. Think about how states use their military might, their economic leverage to influence global affairs. That core idea that states are fundamentally tied to power dynamics, whether it's through diplomacy or conflict, well, that's still relevant.
I see the connection.
Yeah,
So states are products of history, often shaped by conflict. But what makes a state a state? Like, what are the essential elements?
great question. Our sources highlight five key features. Think of them as building blocks. You start with sovereignty, which we've touched on. Then you've got public institutions, courts, police, government agencies, all designed to serve the people. For a state to really work, it needs legitimacy, meaning people accept its authority as rightful.
So it's not just about brute force. There needs to be some buy-in from the people.
Absolutely. States rely on more than just coercion, but we can't forget about domination. This is where Max Weber's idea comes in the state having a monopoly on violence.
Okay, this idea of domination, it's a little tricky. Does this mean states inherently rely on like the threat of force to maintain order? How does that fit with the concept of a just and ethical state?
It's a tension that exists in every state. The state claims the exclusive right to use force legitimately within its territory. But that power can definitely be misused. That's why we have things like accountability, transparency, the rule of law. These are vital to limiting the potential for abuse.
Got it. It's a delicate balancing act between keeping things in order and protecting individual rights. What's the fifth piece of the puzzle? What's that final feature of a state?
Territorial association. A state needs clearly defined geographical borders. It sets it apart from others. This idea is actually enshrined in international law, specifically the Montevideo Convention of 1933. It outlines the criteria for a state to be recognized on the world stage.
I'm guessing this convention lays down some ground rules for how states interact with each other.
Exactly. It specifies that a state needs a few things. It has to have a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and the capacity to engage in relations with other states. Think of it as the rule book for statehood in the global arena.
All right, so we've got a pretty good handle on what makes a state a state. But that brings us to the big question. How are these states actually governed?
Now we're getting to the heart of it. There are lots of different systems of government out there, but our political science lecture focuses on three main categories: autocratic communist and liberal democratic. Let's start by breaking down autocracy.
Okay. Those terms get thrown around a lot, and I'll admit it's easy to mix them up. Can you walk us through each one?
Of course. Autocratic regimes, they concentrate power in the hands of a single person, a small group, or a single party, often with very few limitations.
So think kings, dictators, ruling families, right?
Exactly. Citizen participation in government is often restricted. They maintain order through force, or at least the threat of it. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. Classic case of traditional autocracy, or the military junta led by General Pinochet in Chile. Different forms, but both with power concentrated at the top.
So in an autocracy, it's all about control. What about communist regimes? How are they different?
Communist regimes are usually one party states with the Communist Party holding all the power. They're often influenced by Marxist Leninist ideology. The goal, at least in theory, is to create a classless society.
Many developing nations, especially in Africa, adopted this model in the 20th century, right?
That's right. While the ideal is equality and working for the common good, the reality can be quite different. In practice, these regimes often suppress dissent and limit individual freedoms in order to achieve their ideological goals. They also tend to favor centrally planned economies.
So not exactly a haven for individual liberty. That brings us to the third category, liberal democratic systems.
Mm.
That's what we have here, right?
Exactly. Liberal democracies are built on very different principles. They emphasize individual rights and freedoms with a government based on the consent of the governed. We're talking free and fair elections, multiple political parties competing for power, a free press. It's a system designed with checks and balances to prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
Okay, that's a pretty clear distinction. So we've got autocracies where power is concentrated and individual freedoms are limited. Communist regimes aiming for a classless society, but often using authoritarian tactics.
Mhm.
And liberal democracies built on individual rights and citizen participation.
You've got it. But there's another model that emerged after World War II, the Three Worlds model. It categorized countries based on their political and economic systems.
You mean the capitalist first world, communist second world, and the developing third world? Isn't that model a bit outdated now, though? Considering the fall of the Soviet Union and how much the global landscape has changed?
You raise an important point. The Three Worlds model is definitely seen as problematic by many. The Second World basically vanished with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And the term Third World, well, it's come to be seen as derogatory, implying inferiority.
Yeah, I could see how that would be offensive.
Exactly. It's a relic of the Cold War era. Today, you hear terms like developing countries or low and lower middle income countries used instead.
So we have these models,
Hmm.
but the world isn't so neatly divided anymore, is it? It seems way more complex than just slapping a label on a country.
Absolutely. You have countries with elements of both democracy and authoritarianism, market economies with strong socialist elements, all sorts of hybrid systems. It's more of a spectrum than a black and white categorization.
This is giving me a lot to think about. Before we go any further, I want to remind everyone listening to subscribe to the deep dive for more insightful episodes like this one. We'll be back in a moment to explore even more about these fascinating systems.
It really is, and this actually brings us to another layer. I think a lot of people get tripped up on the relationship between a state and a nation.
Okay, yeah, help me out here. We've been talking about states, but what exactly do we mean by nation and how is it different?
All right, so think of it this way. A state is a political entity. It's got those five key features we talked about: sovereignty, public institutions, legitimacy, domination, and territorial association.
Okay.
But a nation, that's more of a cultural or social concept.
So a nation is more about like shared values, traditions, language, a sense of collective identity.
You got it. It's that feeling of belonging to a particular group. But here's the thing, the two, they don't always perfectly overlap.
Ah, so that's where the term nation state comes in.
Exactly. A nation state is that ideal scenario where the political boundaries of a state line up perfectly with the cultural boundaries of a nation.
So everyone within the borders feels like a strong sense of national unity and shared identity.
Ideally, yes. But in reality, very few states actually achieve that perfect harmony.
Right.
Many states are multinational, meaning they've got multiple national groups within their borders.
That makes sense. Like Canada with its distinct French and English-speaking populations, or Belgium with its Flemish and Walloon communities.
Perfect examples. And then you have situations where a single nation might be spread across multiple states, like the Kurds in the Middle
So
East.
this whole state versus nation thing, it's more of a spectrum than a clear-cut distinction.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic interplay between political structures
Mm.
and cultural identities. And yeah, it can get pretty complex.
That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
We've covered the origins and characteristics of states, different systems of government, and now this nuanced relationship between states and nations.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's
Yeah.
so much more to explore, like the different forms of democracy, the impact of globalization, and the challenges facing states in the 21st century.
Well, I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more. If our listeners are as intrigued as I am, make sure you hit that subscribe button to catch our future deep dives. We'll be back after a short break to wrap up this episode with some final thoughts. Okay, we're back. And, this deep dive has really made me rethink some things about states and governments. Our sources mentioned something that really stuck with me, this idea that maybe we don't need a state at all.
That's a big question, isn't it? Do we really need this whole overarching structure to organize ourselves?
Exactly. After everything we've talked about, the history of states, their features, how they can be both good and bad, it's a pretty radical idea to even consider.
It is radical, but it's definitely worth exploring. I mean, for centuries, the state has been the dominant way we organize ourselves politically. But there are some thinkers out there who argue that it's outdated, maybe even harmful.
So what's the alternative then? Anarchy. Everyone defending for themselves. I don't see that working out too well.
Not necessarily anarchy. There are a bunch of different schools of thought on this. Some folks advocate for smaller, more decentralized communities where power is more spread out, while others propose models based on cooperation and consensus building rather than top down authority.
So it's about like reimagining how we function as a society, finding new ways to tackle those big challenges without relying on the traditional state structure. But how would we handle things like security and defense without a strong central authority? That's what I wonder.
That's a huge question, of course. People who support stateless societies, they argue that a lot of the problems we face today, war, poverty, environmental destruction, they say these things are actually caused or made worse by the state itself. They believe alternative systems could be more effective and fairer.
Wow, that's a pretty different way of looking at things. So are we on the verge of a stateless utopia then? Is that even realistic?
Let's not get too carried away. It's a complicated debate with no easy answers. The reality is, states with all their flaws do provide a certain level of stability and order. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't question their role and think about other possibilities.
I think that's a great takeaway from this deep dive. It's easy to just accept things as they are without really questioning the power structures that shape our lives.
You're right. It's about thinking critically, recognizing that there are many ways to organize a society.
And who knows, maybe some of our listeners will be inspired to come up with some innovative solutions. So here's a final question for everyone to ponder. Given all we've learned about how differently governments function and those alternative models we touched on, what factors do you think might make a state stable or unstable in the 21st century?
That's a tough one. It's a complex question with no simple answers, but it's one we all need to think about as we navigate this increasingly interconnected and rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. And if you've enjoyed this exploration of states and governments, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more thought-provoking episodes. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.